Earlier this week, we celebrated the annual Human Rights Day on the 10th of December. And the theme for this year was Building Back Better through Respect for Human Rights and Human Dignity. To talk about human rights and human dignity and a lot of the issues that we've been facing as a nation in the past few months, we have invited the Commissioner of the Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission of Fiji, Mr. Ashwin Raj. Mr. Raj, good evening and welcome.
Good evening to you and good evening, Fiji.
So just to start us off, let's talk about the atmosphere in Fiji throughout this year. Of course, we've been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. It had an unprecedented and rapidly, shifting challenge that it presented to the nation. So talk to us about protecting and promoting human rights in the context of, a post-COVID-19 world. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us what the key challenges have been for human rights issues?
Yes. So, not just Fiji, but globally, I think the human rights landscape is shifting dramatically. You are witnessing, unprecedented interdiction of rights and freedoms. You are also seeing the emergence of new human rights challenges that are transboundary in nature, right? So they're not locked within the nation state, framework. And so if you look at the existential threat around climate change, the human rights challenges associated with COVID-19, the economic malaise that is afflicting the world, these borders have become very porous and it's affecting all of us. But what COVID-19 has done is it has also accentuated some of the existing inequalities and human rights challenges in our world. So, I'd like to put a caveat out there, not everything is as a result of COVID-19. There were certain things that were broken globally before COVID-19. So for a lot of people, COVID-19 has become the ideological justification. Yet at the same time, you cannot discount the fact that there are certain human rights challenges that have particularly become accentuated because of the pandemic. So one of the most critical one is the relationship between rights and restrictions and striking a precarious balance between the two, so that the restrictions, the justifiable restrictions in law that you would place in the interest of protecting public health does not result in the diminution of rights and freedoms and the derogation of fundamental rights that you absolutely cannot do without, such as the right to life, right? So striking that balance has become very, very important. And it has also, compelled people to think through what our laws are saying, how our laws best respond to these things, so that there is a harmony between rights and responsibilities. You've seen states world over, impose lockdowns and curfews and other forms of restriction, restriction on your right to freedom of movement, your right to peaceful assembly, and so on and so forth, in the interest of public health. So the biggest challenge is, how do you ensure that these restrictions are actually in consonance with our human rights obligations? So one of the things that we actually do is we seek recourse through international law. And international law, actually international human rights law, says that restrictions need to be one, prescribed by law, so they're not arbitrary in nature, right? So your rights are not just taken away because somebody decided one morning, I'm going to take it away. It's actually prescribed by law. The second thing is that it is proportionate, right? The restrictions are proportionate to meet a pressing social need, right? And the third thing is that it is legitimate, right? And necessary in a democratic society. So this fundamental criteria is consistent not only in international human rights law, but also in our constitutional interpretation. So our constitution also provides for the restriction to certain rights and freedoms to an extent that the exercise of certain rights and freedoms that I have does not result in the diminution of rights and freedoms that you should invariably enjoy under the Constitution. So striking that balance requires that limitations be prescribed by law, it's proportionate, it's necessary, it meets a pressing social need. And so one of the things that we look at when you look at the restrictions in the name of public health, right, in the current context, not just Fiji but globally, we look at the Syracuse guidelines. They're very, very useful. They're very, very useful because these guidelines, enable us to think about restrictions within a human rights framework, within a rule of law framework. So one of the major challenges is, in relation to the current pandemic is, reassessing the relationship between rule of law and human rights, striking that right balance between rights and restrictions, and also becoming much more intimate with our laws, whether the laws in place are adequate to address the complexity of constraints within which we are forced to act. Because, a pandemic is not something that we have every day. And it's not something that we've been preparing all our lives for. So I know that there was a lot of social commentary in the media and, lots of people making snarky comments and all of that about how, things are being applied retrospectively and all of that. We need to think through the fact that, we've had to deal with an issue that nobody was prepared for. Suddenly the borders start closing, people are falling off like flies, death is very real. The economic malaise, that is beginning to afflict the world, and the social ills that come with it, right? Poverty, violence, structural inequality, xenophobia, racism, the increase in intolerance, hatred, homelessness, violence, domestic violence, abuse of children. All of those things get accentuated, and all is happening all at once. And now, states are just compelled to think through, what kind of social welfare scheme do we have? Do our existing definitions of vulnerability actually, work? Are they suitable? Or the nature of vulnerability and who constitutes the vulnerable, are the same? Are the laws adequate? What do we do to put various kinds of measures in place to put an arrest to all of this?
And a lot of those questions have become very relevant to us as a nation in Fiji. We'd like to talk about, some real-world examples and talk about some of the commentary that was coming through. The questions in relation to the use of security forces and the reliance on security forces to enforce some of these restrictions. The constitutional and legal justification for some of these restrictions. So when we come back from break, that's what we're discussing. Stay with us. So a lot of the restrictions that we had in place during COVID-19 and the restrictions that we still have in place have been questioned as to whether or not they are legally justified, whether or not we need them. People have questioned the reliance on security forces in order to enforce some of those restrictions. So talk to us about in your opinion, some of the questions that you posed.
Very early on, the National Human Rights Commission issued a series of statements, and also we did, an analysis piece in terms of, whether this is justified in law, this kind of limitation. And yes, when, there is a global health crisis that can threaten the existence of the nation state, the life of the nation state itself, absolutely. But like I said, it needs to be prescribed in law. And so one of the things that we do seek recourse from is the Public Health Act of 1935. And that makes it very, very clear that in the event of, a disease or a pandemic, you do place restrictions on freedom of movement and all of that. And it's an old legislation that still holds. You see what I mean? So the only difference was, the amendments were to the penal liabilities in the event that people transgress that particular, provision of the law, and also the nature of pandemic, which obviously keeps changing all the time. So or disease or whatever the affliction might be. So it is justifiable, but the limitations need to be interpreted in consonance with the principles of democracy, rule of law, and human rights, so that people don't abuse these restrictions and unduly take away rights and freedoms. And so, I mean, that is where the whole question of arbitrary detention, of torture and brutality, on the role of law enforcement agencies, so that they, one, uphold the rule of law, but also ensure that they respect fundamental rights and freedoms and human dignity and all of that, has become the most pressing issue. So you'd see that the National Human Rights Commission is busy, investigating allegations of torture, brutality, cruel and degrading and inhuman treatment, of arbitrary arrests and all of that. Fundamental questions around the rule of law and human rights in relation to, for instance, the four gentlemen who finished work really late, then called up a particular police station and said, hey, it's almost 11 o'clock, what do we do? And they went to report to the police station, and they ended up being locked up for however number of hours, which absolutely is unconstitutional. So I mean, those kind of unfortunate developments actually compel us to think through the relationship between rule of law and human rights. The other issue, of course, is that the old divide between civil and political rights and social, economic, and cultural rights is actually not a very felicitous binary, because economic, social, and cultural rights and civil and political rights are inextricably woven into each other's fabric. And you can see it nowhere better than in the current context. Because I think depending on your politics, people normally try and, in human rights world, privilege civil and political rights, about the right to assembly, to march, to protest, freedom of expression, so on and so forth. And, they always think about, social and economic rights as, second generation, they call it, which itself is very, very problematic, right? Second generation, set of rights that are almost secondary. COVID-19 is teaching us that, you need to have these basic rights, the social, economic rights, to be able to realize all those other rights. I mean, it's not that kind of linear trajectory where civil and political has to be first before you can think about economic and social. Inequality can also lead to political instability and all of that. So that's where we are. And if you don't have the right to health and all of that, you won't have the right to economic participation. You don't have the right to economic participation, you basically lose all those other political rights that you need, absolutely need, to create a much more just and equal society. So it's a cycle. And all the rights are indivisible, interdependent, and that's what COVID-19 is beginning to unravel for a lot of people who've been operating in silos.
So if you allow me to interject, Ashwin, just with what you've said in the previous segment and with your answer to Ziad's question, if we were to look in retrospect 2020 and Fiji, not on a global scale, just Fiji locally, where do we fare in terms of balance with the rule of law and also with human rights in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic?
I think that's a great question. And, and I don't say this in jest, I really mean it, because I've been in this space long enough to tell you that it depends on the politics of the person, the organization, because for a lot of people, the primary focus has been on civil and political rights, because that's their agenda, right? To be able to march, to protest, to exercise freedom of expression, to dissent and all of that. Then there are people on the ground for whom, quite frankly, and I know I'm going to offend some political sensibilities, but I got to lay it out because we are with the people all the time, 24/7. It doesn't mean much, because if they don't have, food on their table, roof over their head, the right to protest and march and exercise freedom of expression doesn't mean much, quite frankly. And so for us, at the Commission, we have been very busy with, ordinary folks, and day in, day out, literally, long hours to the most far ends of the country, giving out food vouchers. They've been removed from their homes, houses are being demolished, they've lost their jobs and all of that. And, there is an appetite in the human rights world in terms of how each of these categories of people are looking at various kinds of rights. For some, the whole stuff around freedoms and exercise of political rights is absolutely important because that's the subject position they occupy. There could be civil society organizations, there could be politicians and all of that. But for ordinary folks out there, and I'm not saying that the social and economic rights means that they're not thinking the political, but for them, the questions around economic inequality are essentially political questions. You see what I mean? And so I think it's a great question, and that's the kind of discussion we should be having about the problem of preferentially framing the human rights question, not only in terms of COVID-19, but also in the larger sort of context around human rights globally. And so if there is a lugubrious consolation in all of this, glimpse of hope in this miasma of despair, it's that COVID-19 has really compelled us to stop thinking along partitioned lines about human rights, because all of these things are interdependent. And it depends on the subject position you occupy. When you're struggling with bread and butter issues, some of these things are so far removed from your political imaginary. But it's there, it's always in the backdrop, because that's the fuel that would lead to dissent, right, and all of those other things, which again raises fundamental questions around law and order, rule of law. Yeah.
It's an interesting point. We'll carry on the discussion when we come back in our next break. Stay with us. Welcome back. Mr. Raj, one of the issues that we absolutely have to talk about, since we have you here, is police brutality. So we know that a lot of these cases are still being investigated. Some of them are before court, so we won't ask you any specifics of these cases. But a lot of people have questioned the role of the Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission when there is a case of police brutality. So I'd just like to get your opinion on where do you see the Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission being in all of this, in this?
If I could just add on to what Ziad is saying, in the same context, if you could just give us a breakdown as to why there are so many people that have all of these opinions on as to why certain cases may take a longer time for the Commission to issue a statement, why follow-ups may take more time, why it takes more time to present to court. Your thoughts and the process behind that.
First of all, a very, very clear and principled statement that we do not condone any act of violence, right? The police needs to subject itself to accountability, to transparency, because, we have certain obligations not only under international law in terms of, the various, human rights treaties that we are signatory to, but also our own constitution. Everybody has the right to be free from cruel, degrading, and inhuman treatment. And wherever we hear of an incident of, police brutality or even, conduct of police that is not, consistent with human dignity, or conduct of police that, amounts to an abuse of office, an abuse of power, an abuse of responsibility, we try and hold them to account. You would have seen in a number of incidences, the Sinu case, the Batai case, what happened in Nangia, the incident where somebody, suffered very severe burns, in Navua when they were being interrogated and all of that. The Commission has not shied away from any of these cases. We investigate, but we want to avoid trial by media, because it's important that people face the criminal justice system, without that kind of prejudice. And so what we do is we investigate, we issue a very, very principled statement, we investigate, and investigation takes time. Remember, this is a commission of about 7-8 people, right? And we go to the far ends of the country. Imagine driving from Suva every day to Nangia, right? And then coming back. In a commission which is about 7-8 people, which has had a budget cut of, $500,000. These investigations are resource consuming. And it's not that one particular case that we look at. We are dealing with all kinds of other human rights complaints. But we prioritize these things. A lot of people get very impatient with us. They say, oh, so somebody, if there's somebody, somebody has died at the hands of the police or they've been brutalized or whatever, obviously that's more important to you than my case about employment relations. And I have to say, well, absolutely. And under the law, we do have the right to prioritize some of the pressing and urgent cases because these are issues of national interest. This doesn't mean that that other human rights complaint is not as important. But for us to be able to take a matter to court, we gotta be methodical, right? We need to investigate thoroughly. It means interviewing witnesses. It means, trying to enter the protocols of the victims of torture and brutality. It takes a lot of courage for them to speak their mind. They're afraid about, of the possibility of reprisal and recrimination. Witnesses sometimes get intimidated, right? It's when there are contradictory statements and all of that. We have to wait for, proper medical reports and all of that. We also have to ensure that the institutions that are under scrutiny have the right to respond. So by the time all of those things happen, it does take a bit of time. So, one of the criticisms that has been recently leveled against the Human Rights Commission is that, X individual went to their respective organization and has been saying that we haven't been updating this person. And incidentally, this went for a month or whatever. My point is, as the Human Rights Commission is doing this thing, and if you're privy to a member of public who has appealed to you, call the Human Rights Commission and bring this to our attention, because we're still acting in the interest of those individuals who have, felt the brunt of human rights abuse. But what we're doing is we're chasing institutions, because that's very, very important. Until and unless we hold the police or any other law enforcement agency to account and get a proper response and file those things in a court of law, you're not going to get justice for this individual. Yes, you may end up issuing a statement, condemning this and that, and you're saying, well, the Human Rights Commission didn't do anything. But, it's a self-indulgent exercise, which does not translate into justice. And so our concern always has been that we must provide remedy, institutional recourse, and accountability. And sometimes those things take time, because you gotta be methodical. You gotta, make sure that you've interviewed everybody. You have to put your personal biases aside. You have to be absolutely independent, right? You have to avoid running parallel commentary on the social media, because it doesn't do justice to the case. These are issues of national interest, and we do issue statements in the beginning to say we absolutely condemn this, we're going to now investigate. Then we file our report with the police, because we don't have the powers to charge. We have to file it with the police because it's a crime. It is a crime, and then we wait for the office of the DPP, which is independent, to file those charges and all of that, right? So it takes a while. But that doesn't mean that we are covering things under the carpet. By no means. We take every allegation very, very seriously. We have to go to the police station. We have to look at the register. We have to see how many police officers were there. When did they call the person in? Did they do a medical, checkup? All of that. When did this bruise appear? Right? If the person was, very healthy when the person was taken in, when did this bruise appear? Right? When did they, suffer a concussion? So on and so forth. So it is more than simply condemning and investigating. You have to be so methodical.
Stay with us. We'll come back from a short break and carry on the discussion on police brutality. Welcome back. Mr. Raj, we were discussing police brutality and the various cases that have happened, the increase in frequency of cases that have happened, especially this year. We know that the Constitution gives protection to people when they're being arrested. They are protected against torture. We know that the Fiji Police Force has internal policies that are designed to punish police officers who don't fall in line, who commit these acts. Why then are we still seeing so many cases? And how do we really put an end to police brutality in Fiji?
I think you're gesturing towards a larger question. And that is about the prevalence of violence in our society, right? Not just police. I mean, we're seeing violence in homes, we are seeing violence in schools, we are seeing violence in the public sphere, right? And so until and unless we deal with the entrenched culture of violence, which seems to be the answer to every problem we have, somebody begins to question something and boom, a slap, right? We got to change that culture. And this is why the constitutional definition on the right to be free from cruel and degrading and inhuman treatment actually talks about work, school, and home, right? It's a very expensive definition of torture, which is not, narrowly confined to that of the state. And until unless we address that entrenched culture of violence and entrenched culture of patriarchy, because, face it, women and children are disproportionately affected by violence, and it has actually, exacerbated in the current context when there's so much inequality, there's poverty, there's homelessness, there's so much domestic violence because people just simply don't and are unable to make ends meet, which leads to more frustration. People are losing their jobs and all of that. And the fact that if there's violence already in homes and suddenly they're all locked up and they got to face each other 24 hours in a day, it heightens that sense of tension and violence and all of that. And so until unless we address that, we're not going to have a turnaround in the situation. I give you an example. We receive a complaint at about 5 p.m. that this is what has transpired at one of the boarding schools. I travel from 5 p.m. in Suva, I go to Tel Aviv, after I've interviewed the parents and the children and all of that. And we go to Koronivia police station, we lodge a complaint at about 10:30, we get these children to give their statements and all of that. And as I'm listening intently to the statement, I realized how insidious violence is, right? And the ways in which we perpetuate a culture of violence, which is not just physical. I think people forget it's not just physical, but it's also psychological, emotional violence. So these children, they were compelled to either have chilies rubbed in their mouth and their genitalia, or have this reported to their parents. And none of them, interestingly enough, wanted their parents to know that they had broken certain rules at the boarding school. And got me thinking, we have a very perverse notion of violence at play that people are using. And to me, it's a very, very sad indictment of how this actually works. So imagine you're inflicting that kind of violence on children to then, law enforcement agencies, using full force, brute violence that results in the loss of lives. So there is a big culture of violence. And it is related. It is related not just to our ability to exercise civil and political rights, but also because of structural inequality. Right? And structural inequality in terms of inequality along the axis of gender, along the axis of class, and it also takes various other turns in terms of prohibited grounds of discrimination. So people make all kinds of remarks based on somebody's ethnicity or religion and all of that. And until unless we put a cap on all of these things, it will translate into violence. So you see what's happening on the social media. People openly call for violence. I mean, they berate, they defame people, they rob them of their sense of dignity. And until unless we become vigilant and we put a stop to all of that, it will translate into violence.
Allow me to go off on a tangent
Yes.
over here. As you said, this is a culture of violence. It's systematic on all levels, on all different
Yes.
forms. When it comes to reporting these things, trying to not necessarily cure it, but to try and stem it in some way or form, of course, you need to have these cases reported. However, you see mostly it's either victims or members of the family of the victim
Yes.
or those that are known to the victim that report it. Why aren't people from within the system reporting these kind of issues?
Yes.
You happen to see this happen within armed forces. You happen to see this within schools. You happen to see this within communities. this doesn't often happen that a police officer has reported another police
Yes.
officer, or
Yes.
that a pastor has reported another pastor,
Yes.
stuff like that.
Yes.
On the same note, just in relation to that question, I'm also going to ask you, do you think that there's a culture of impunity within
Yes.
our security
Yes.
forces?
Look, both really, really important, observations, and completely agree with you. The point is that, we do get those instances where police officers have given witness statements. There's a particular case, and before the courts and all of that, so I just want to hold back. But, where they have, given us statements to say, well, we've witnessed this, and it's a violent act, and this was, actually done by a particular officer, so on and so forth. So you do get those incidences, but, it also means that these institutions need to subject themselves to those kind of democratic audits, right? So that they're able to freely say that, look, something is going on here which is unacceptable, and it's resulted in an abuse of, I actually don't want to say authority, or it's an abuse of responsibility, because they have an important responsibility to the public, right? To make sure that everybody's safe, protected, all of that. The other thing is that, democratizing the institutions means that you have to deal with the hierarchy. I mean, I have to say that for the most part, we've had a cordial relationship with law enforcement agencies, but things get really heated up. Because, as a National Human Rights Commission, our job is not hunky-dory. We don't shake hands and sip tea and talk about things. Yes, we train them and all of that. We do a lot of training with law enforcement agencies, but it also, at the end of the day, means having some of those very, very ugly exchanges when somebody dies at the hand of the police, or somebody's beaten up and you're trying to access documents, and you are pointing fingers. So it's not a rosy relationship. Our job is not a romantic job. We don't sit there and issue statements and disappear. We're actually in the field. We have to go into a police station. We have to impress ourselves in those spaces. The relationship between the police and human rights has changed dramatically. Today we can go into a police station. We have human rights walls in police stations. We're able to question the conduct of the police. We're able to issue statements. We're able to hold them to account. We continuously follow things with internal affairs and all of that. So I'm not going to say that all things are bad. However, we need to sustain this culture. This also means having a lot of uncomfortable conversations. It means holding each other to account. I always say to my Human Rights Commission team too, don't go in and act as if you own the police station. Enter the protocols. It is the police station. It's their territory and all of that. But ensure that there is transparency in the process. Ensure that there is professionalism. Ensure that there is accountability. Because it is a very fraught relationship, and we are both walking on thin ice. But the one thing I wanted to say is that, the sooner we realize that all of these violations are actually, doing irreparable damage to Fiji's reputation, because we're punching above our weight. You look at our reputation in terms of climate activism. You look at our reputation in terms of standing up against racism and all of that. You look at our reputation in terms of, a number of other global interventions are placed in multilateralism and all of that. Our vice presidency of the Human Rights Council, we've achieved a lot. And I know there are people who continuously, look down on Fiji, and they are citizens of this country, but they love to watch Fiji sink. I mean, I'd say that there's a lot that we have achieved, and we need to be proud of. But moments like this, when somebody is beaten to a pulp, when somebody dies at the hands of the law enforcement agencies, it does irreparable damage, right? It gives, license to a whole bunch of international media who wouldn't care about the kind of human rights training we do and the struggles we have fighting with law enforcement agencies on a daily basis. They'll play the politics, and they'll take that incident and they'll amplify it. And it almost seems like, you read the articles, from The Guardian and all of that, it almost seems like, there's a full-on war going on in this country. They say, for 800,000 people, there are only 7 or 8 human rights officers at the Human Rights Commission, almost as if, the millions are, battling with human rights issues on a daily basis of that scale in terms of torture and brutality. So they amplify. And so I keep appealing to the pathos of law enforcement agencies that the only people that are going to lose in this are us, Fijians. There's no you, there's no me, There's no us in them, it's we are in it. And when the country loses its reputation, it assumes the notoriety of a country which is, just all about brute violence and all of that. We lose all of the gains, and we have achieved a lot, and we got to sustain that. And particularly in the current context around COVID-19 and all of that, where there are restrictions in place, you can't let violence flourish. The other thing I wanted to say is that there are a lot of people that will criticize and run commentaries, but they never want to see remedies sought.
Right.
They don't want solutions because they like to keep people in a state of injury so that they can make their political point that nothing is working in this country. I always say to people, if you have political differences, and you have the right to have political differences, put your ego aside and access those institutions, because these are public institutions. The Human Rights Commission, Legal Aid Commission, we are all public bodies, right? It belongs to the people of this country. So please, put your ego aside, pick up the phone, give us a call, lodge your complaint. And if still doesn't work, then you can say, all right, you're not independent. But if you're just, spouting a number of things without having tried and tested the institutions, none of this is going to work.
Thank you, Mr. Raj. We'll go to our final break, and we'll come back and talk about the activities that the Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission has planned for 2021. Stay with us. Final segment. Mr. Raj, we've spoken about a lot of issues. Let's talk about the year in review for the Human Rights Commission, some of the major achievements for the Commission, and what we can expect from the HRADC in 2021.
Yes. We have been able to receive and independently investigate complaints without any obstruction from the state. We are able to exercise our mandate. The Commission, is fully committed to ensuring that it's a Paris Principle compliant Commission, and to that end, one of the biggest achievements was undergoing a capacity assessment that was organized and led by the Asia Pacific Forum of National Human Rights Institutions, the UNDP, and Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So that's a major achievement for the Commission. The other thing, of course, is that we are on the cusp of opening an office in Lautoka. So despite all the limitations in terms of budgetary constraints and human resource and capital, we are on the cusp of opening an office in Lautoka, which is going to be of huge help because we can't imagine people traveling from all parts of the West to Suva to lodge a complaint. So we're trying to democratize, and decentralize. The other thing is that we are going to have a complaints management system, so that, and this is through the generous funding from the Commonwealth Equality Initiative, to set up a complaints management system so that we can have veritable data around the types of complaints that is going to help us, produce alternative reports, assessing and appraising how much the state has achieved and where it's lagging and all of that. One of the major focuses, of the Commission is obviously going to be about reevaluating and recalibrating our human rights priorities, particularly in light of the recommendations, from the UPR process, the Universal Periodic Review, the recommendations made by the Law, Justice and Human Rights Parliamentary Standing Committee based on the annual reports that the Commission had submitted to Parliament, but also in relation to the kinds of complaints we are now beginning to see documented by our media. So we are going to go into the strategic planning mode in which we're going to invite, development partners, but also we're going to open up, submissions to members of the public so that they can, drive the human rights agenda and tell us what's our priority. But this also has to be situated by the understanding that the human rights landscape has shifted dramatically with the existential threat of climate change, the advent of COVID-19, but other kinds of transboundary challenges such as human trafficking. The Commission at the moment is dealing with a whole bunch of foreign nationals whose passports have been confiscated by the employers. We're dealing with the Fiji Police, the anti-trafficking unit of the Fiji Police Force, the Ministry of Labor, the Department of Immigration. So we got to think about a number of these transboundary human rights challenges as well. And one of the big focuses, I think, for next year is going to be the role of business in human rights. How do we constructively engage the private sector in human rights? Because it's not just the state. The state is but a partial and incipient fragment in this entire kaleidoscope, right? It does have the primary responsibility of protecting and promoting human rights, but we need to engage the private sector. At a time when we need to boost the economy, you can't have them out of the room. You got to have them in the room. But how do you make sure that they are also allies in the human rights struggle? So that's going to be a major focus for us at the Commission.
Just a final question. Can we look forward to any major events that the HREDC, it's too long to say for me, pardon me for that, that they might have coming up in 2021, apart from the opening of the new Olotoka Center?
I am certainly hoping, resource permitting, we want to be able to have at least one national inquiry on a pressing human rights issue. And a national inquiry is one which is very resource consuming, it's extremely expensive, you gotta have technical people, people on the ground who can do the extensive interviews and all of that. So I want to be able to have that discussion, of course, with our chairperson, commissioners, and various stakeholders to see, which issue. It could be this issue around, police brutality. It could be around child abuse or whatever, a pressing national issue that becomes the subject of national inquiry. And hopefully we can produce a report and recommendations on how to address an intractable human rights challenge for us.
Mr. Raj, unfortunately we've run out of time, but thank you so much for joining us. Of course, so many pressing issues. We would definitely love to have you again. But thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much, and I really owe the media for continuously, bringing the plight of ordinary Fijians to our attention. It's a very constructive working relationship where we hold each other to account. So I very much appreciate what you do. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed the show this evening. Thank you for joining us, and have a good evening.